I used to believe loyalty meant something in the workplace. For 8 years, I walked into the same glass building every morning at 7:30 a.m., usually before anyone else arrived. The cleaning staff knew me by name. The coffee machine practically recognized the sound of my footsteps. I was the first person in the office and almost always the last one to leave. My name is Eliza Morgan, and for 8 years I worked as the senior client coordinator at a marketing firm in Chicago. Officially, my job titles sounded small. Unofficially, I was the person who kept the entire company from falling apart. Every client relationship, every crisis call, every impossible deadline somehow ended up on my desk. If a client threatened to cancel their contract, they called me. If a campaign failed hours before launch, I fixed it. If my boss made promises he couldn't keep, I was the one who stayed late figuring out how to make them possible. At first, I didn't mind. I believed hard work eventually spoke for itself. My boss, Richard Callahan, was the kind of man who loved being the smartest person in the room. He had this polished confidence that impressed clients instantly. Tall, perfectly tailored suits, always smiling like he had everything under control. Clients adored him. But the truth was that most of what impressed them had nothing to do with him. I was the one designing the solutions, calming their frustrations, and making sure every promise he made actually happened. In meetings, he would say things like, "Don't worry, my team will take care of it," and then everyone would look at me because we all knew who that team really was. For a long time, I convinced myself that this was just how companies worked. The boss took credit, the employees did the work. But over the years, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Every time a project succeeded, Richard celebrated it as his victory. When something went wrong, he quietly redirected the blame down the ladder. Once, during a major client presentation, he actually interrupted me mid-sentence to repeat the exact idea I had just explained, but suddenly it was his strategy. The room applauded him. I sat there smiling politely, while my stomach twisted. Still, I stayed. 8 years is a long time to convince yourself that patience will eventually be rewarded. The breaking point began slowly, like a crack forming in glass. One afternoon, about 6 months before everything collapsed, a major client called in a panic. Their campaign had malfunctioned, and the launch deadline was less than 12 hours away. Richard was conveniently in a strategy dinner across town, which meant I was alone in the office with 2 interns and a problem that could cost the company a 6-figure contract. I worked through the night fixing it. By sunrise, the campaign was running perfectly again. The client sent an email thanking Richard personally for his incredible dedication. Richard forwarded the message to the whole company with a reply that simply said, "Glad we could pull it off." We. Not even a mention of my name. That should have been the moment I walked away. But instead I told myself something dangerous. Maybe next time he would acknowledge the work. The next time came 3 weeks later. A quarterly review meeting had been scheduled with the entire leadership team. I wasn't supposed to attend, but Richard suddenly asked me to join halfway through because one of the executives had questions about client retention numbers. I walked into the room carrying a tablet full of reports I had spent weeks preparing. The numbers were excellent. Client satisfaction was higher than it had been in years. But instead of discussing the results, Richard leaned back in his chair and gave me a look I had never seen before. It wasn't appreciation. It was calculation. "Eliza," he said slowly, "you've been with the company a long time." I nodded, unsure where this was going. 8 years, he continued. "And while we appreciate loyalty, we also have to evaluate efficiency." Efficiency. The word hung in the air like smoke. He started talking about cost restructuring and department optimization. The executives listened quietly while he explained how certain roles had become financially disproportionate. I realized he was talking about me before he even said my name. Then he reached into a folder and slid a single sheet of paper across the table toward me. A salary adjustment notice. My pay was being cut in half. 50%. I stared at the paper for a long moment because my brain refused to process what I was seeing. 8 years of loyalty, thousands of late nights, endless crisis management, and this was the reward. I looked up slowly and asked the only question that made sense. Why? Richard smiled, not kindly but like someone who had just won a game. "Because you're replaceable," he said. The room was silent. None of the executives spoke. Some of them avoided eye contact. Others looked uncomfortable, but didn't say anything. Richard leaned forward, folding his hands together like a king delivering a verdict. "You're good at what you do," he added. "But the company doesn't need to pay premium salaries for administrative coordination." Administrative coordination. I almost laughed. That was how he described the work that kept half the company's contracts alive. But here's the thing Richard didn't know. For the past 3 months, I had been quietly preparing something he couldn't see. Because somewhere along the way, I had stopped believing his version of the story. Clients didn't call Richard when they had problems. They called me. When they needed strategy advice, they trusted my ideas. Over the years, something interesting had happened. The relationships that built Richard's company weren't really his anymore. They were mine. And about 3 months earlier, one of those clients had asked me a simple question. "Have you ever thought about starting your own firm?" At the time, I laughed it off. But the idea stayed in my mind like a spark waiting for oxygen. Slowly, quietly, I began talking to people. Not aggressively. Not secretly. Just conversations. Coffee meetings. Questions about what clients actually valued. The answer was always the same. Trust. Not corporate titles. Not office buildings. Just trust. And Richard had made one critical mistake. He thought power came from the position behind his desk. He didn't realize power came from the relationships sitting across the table. So when he slid that salary cut across the desk, something inside me became very calm. I folded the paper once. Then again. I placed it neatly on the table and stood up. "You're right," I said quietly. Richard looked satisfied. "I am replaceable." The executives watched me gather my tablet and notebook. I walked to the door before adding one more sentence. "But the relationships aren't." Then I left the room. For the first time in 8 years, I walked out of that building before sunset. And as the elevator doors closed behind me, I realized something important. Richard believed he had just broken me. In reality, he had just given me perfect timing. Because sometimes the worst decision a toxic boss can make is reminding the quiet employee how valuable they actually are. And I had finally decided to stop being invisible. The morning after I walked out of that meeting, the city looked different. Chicago's skyline was glowing under a pale gray sky, and for the first time in 8 years, I didn't rush to the office before sunrise. I sat in my small apartment kitchen with a cup of coffee, staring at the quiet streets below, replaying Richard's words in my mind. "You're replaceable." The sentence should have hurt more than it did, but strangely, it didn't. What hurt was realizing how long I had believed the opposite, that the company needed me, that loyalty mattered, that one day all those late nights and quiet sacrifices would turn into something meaningful. Instead, they had turned into a piece of paper cutting my salary in half. But the calm feeling inside me was real. Because while Richard believed he had cornered me, he had actually accelerated something that was already happening behind the scenes. 3 months earlier, during a casual lunch meeting with one of our longest-standing clients, a woman named Natalie Carter had asked me a question that stuck with me. She ran a tech startup that had grown rapidly over the past few years, and I had been the one handling her marketing campaigns since the beginning. She trusted me more than she trusted the agency. At the end of that lunch, she leaned back in her chair and said, "Eliza, can I ask you something honestly?" I told her, of course. She paused for a moment before saying something that caught me off guard. "If you ever left that company, would you consider working directly with clients instead?" At the time, I laughed nervously and said something safe like, "I don't think Richard would appreciate that." But Natalie didn't laugh. She just looked at me calmly and said, "Richard isn't the reason we stay with your agency. You are." That conversation repeated itself in different forms over the next few weeks. A financial consulting firm asked if I could handle strategy for them personally. A real estate client hinted that if I ever left the agency, they would rather follow me than stay where they were. I never encouraged those conversations directly, but I listened carefully, and slowly, a realization formed that scared me more than it excited me. The relationships Richard believed he owned weren't really his anymore. Still, starting something new felt impossible at the time. 8 years in the same company creates a strange kind of comfort, even when that comfort is toxic. I knew the systems, the routines, the clients, the problems. Leaving meant stepping into uncertainty. So instead of acting immediately, I started quietly preparing. I researched business licenses. I spoke to a lawyer about independent consulting contracts. I even started drafting a simple plan for what a small client-focused marketing firm might look like. Nothing dramatic, just ideas on paper. And then Richard handed me that salary cut. That single moment transformed preparation into action. Later that afternoon, my phone buzzed with a message from Natalie. She had heard about the meeting through someone in the company. News traveled fast in our industry. The message was short. Coffee tomorrow? I think we should talk. We met the next morning at a quiet cafe near the river. She studied my face for a moment before asking, "Are you okay?" I shrugged and told her the truth. I wasn't angry. I was done. Natalie listened carefully as I explained what had happened in the meeting, how Richard had framed my work as administrative coordination. When I finished speaking, she shook her head slowly. "That man has no idea what he just did," she said. "What do you mean?" I asked. She leaned forward slightly. "He just pushed the person who understands half his clients out the door." Then she said something that changed everything. "If you start your own firm, I'll be your first client." The sentence felt unreal. Natalie's company alone represented one of the largest contracts Richard's agency had. Losing it would send shockwaves through the business. But I knew better than to jump at the idea immediately. Building a company wasn't just about one client. It required structure, strategy, and stability. So instead of agreeing right away, I asked her a question. "Why would you take that risk?" Her answer was simple. "Because the only reason our marketing has worked for the past 5 years is because you understand our business. Agencies come and go. People who actually care about results are rare." Over the next week, I had 3 more conversations like that. Each one started cautiously and ended with the same quiet message. If I left, they would follow. Meanwhile, things inside Richard's company began shifting in ways he didn't expect. When I returned to work after the salary cut meeting, I didn't argue or protest. I simply stopped doing the extra things that had once held everything together. The late-night fixes disappeared. The emergency problem-solving calls went unanswered after work hours. I handled only the responsibilities officially listed in my role. Nothing more, nothing less. At first, no one noticed. But small cracks started appearing. A client complained about a delayed response time. An advertising campaign launched with minor errors because the last-minute review process I used to handle quietly no longer existed. Brandon, one of the junior managers, struggled to coordinate a project timeline that I had previously managed effortlessly. None of these problems were catastrophic, but they were noticeable. Richard tried to ignore the pattern. His confidence depended on believing the company functioned perfectly under his leadership. But the reality was more fragile than he realized. The first real confrontation happened 2 weeks later. I was sitting at my desk reviewing reports when Richard suddenly appeared beside me. The sentence felt unreal. Natalie's company alone represented one of the largest contracts Richard's agency had. Losing it would send shockwaves through the business. But I knew better than to jump at the idea immediately. Building a company wasn't just about one client. It required structure, strategy, and stability. So instead of agreeing right away, I asked her a question. "Why would you take that risk?" Her answer was simple. "Because the only reason our marketing has worked for the past 5 years is because you understand our business. Agencies come and go. People who actually care about results are rare." Over the next week, I had 3 more conversations like that. Each one started cautiously and ended with the same quiet message. If I left, they would follow. Meanwhile, things inside Richard's company began shifting in ways he didn't expect. When I returned to work after the salary cut meeting, I didn't argue or protest. I simply stopped doing the extra things that had once held everything together. The late-night fixes disappeared. The emergency problem-solving calls went unanswered after work hours. I handled only the responsibilities officially listed in my role. Nothing more, nothing less. At first, no one noticed. But small cracks started appearing. A client complained about a delayed response time. An advertising campaign launched with minor errors because the last-minute review process I used to handle quietly no longer existed. Brandon, One of the junior managers struggled to coordinate a project timeline that I had previously managed effortlessly. None of these problems were catastrophic, but they were noticeable. Richard tried to ignore the pattern. His confidence depended on believing the company functioned perfectly under his leadership. But the reality was more fragile than he realized. The first real confrontation happened 2 weeks later. I was sitting at my desk reviewing reports when Richard suddenly appeared beside me. His expression was tight, like someone trying to maintain control of a situation that was slowly slipping away. "Eliza," he said sharply, "the Henderson campaign went out with 3 formatting mistakes." I looked up calmly. "Yes, I noticed that. Then why wasn't it fixed before launch?" I folded my hands on the desk. "Because reviewing campaign formatting isn't listed in my responsibilities anymore." He stared at me for a moment, clearly irritated. "You used to handle it." "Yes," I replied quietly. "Before the role restructuring." For the first time since that salary cut meeting, I saw uncertainty flicker in his eyes. Because Richard was beginning to understand something important. The invisible work he had dismissed as administrative had been holding his entire operation together. But by then, something even bigger was already in motion outside the office. During the following weeks, Natalie helped connect me with a small network of entrepreneurs who had grown frustrated with traditional marketing agencies. Many of them had experienced the same problem: flashy presentations followed by poor execution. They didn't want a huge firm. They wanted someone who understood their business personally. Every meeting strengthened my confidence. By the end of the month, I had quietly secured 4 potential clients willing to move their contracts with me if I launched my own firm. The idea that once felt impossible was suddenly becoming real. Meanwhile, inside Richard's office, tension was rising. Client emails were becoming sharper. Project timelines were slipping. And most importantly, several key clients had started requesting meetings with me directly instead of speaking to Richard. He tried to maintain his usual confident image, but the cracks were growing deeper. One afternoon, he called me into his office again. This time there was no smile. "I've been hearing some strange things," he said slowly. "What kind of things?" I asked. "That clients seem unusually loyal to you." I didn't answer right away. Richard leaned back in his chair, studying me carefully. "You wouldn't be planning anything behind my back, would you?" For a moment the room was silent. Then I looked him directly in the eyes and said something that would later become the moment everything truly changed. "No," I said calmly. "I'm planning something in front of it." He didn't understand what I meant yet, but he would soon. Because the quiet employee he believed he controlled was about to make the most important move of her career. And when the first client officially walked out of his company to follow me, Richard Callahan would finally realize something terrifying. The person he thought was replaceable had actually been the foundation holding his entire empire together. I understood something very clearly the day Richard called me into his office again. It wasn't the confident office I had known for 8 years. The atmosphere had changed. His desk was still polished, his suit still perfect, but the calm authority he used to carry had cracks in it now. The company felt different too. Conversations in the hallway stopped when I walked by. People whispered about missed deadlines and frustrated clients. Small problems that used to disappear quietly were now becoming loud enough for everyone to hear. Richard folded his hands on the desk and stared at me like he was trying to read a secret written across my face. "I've been hearing some interesting things," he said slowly. I stayed quiet. "Clients requesting direct meetings with you," he continued. "Clients asking questions about your availability. And one of them even asked whether you were leaving." He paused, waiting for my reaction. I simply looked at him and said nothing. Richard leaned forward slightly. "You wouldn't sabotage this company after everything we've invested in you, would you?" That sentence almost made me laugh. Everything we've invested in you. 8 years of late nights. 8 years of solving crises he didn't even know existed. 8 years of carrying responsibilities that were never part of my job description. If anyone had been investing, it had been me. But I didn't say that. Instead, I kept my voice calm. "I'm still doing the job listed in my contract." He didn't like that answer. His jaw tightened slightly. "You used to go above and beyond," he said. "Yes," I replied quietly. before my role was redefined as administrative. That word hung between us like a reminder of the meeting that had changed everything. Richard said nothing for a few seconds. Then he leaned back in his chair, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Well," he said, "just remember where those clients met you in the first place." I nodded politely. But inside my mind, something had already shifted permanently. Because during the previous week, the first real step had already happened. Natalie Carter had officially signed the first consulting agreement with me. Not with Richard's agency. With me. It was small at first. Just a strategic consulting contract outside of my normal work hours. Completely legal. Completely separate. But it represented something powerful. Proof that my work had value beyond the walls of Richard's company. And Natalie wasn't the only one watching. Within days, 2 more clients asked to meet me privately. We met quietly at coffee shops or small conference spaces across the city. Each conversation followed the same pattern. They spoke about frustration with agency bureaucracy. They talked about slow responses and promises that never turned into results. And eventually, they asked the same question Natalie had asked months earlier. "If you ever started your own firm, would you take us with you?" Every time I heard that question, I felt the same mix of excitement and fear. Because I knew exactly what it meant. It meant leaving safety behind. But it also meant freedom. Meanwhile, inside the company, the cracks were widening. A major retail client complained that their campaign analytics were suddenly inconsistent. The reason was simple. I had stopped performing the extra verification checks I used to run every week. It wasn't sabotage. It was simply the absence of invisible work. Then another issue appeared. One of the internal systems I had designed years earlier stopped functioning properly after a small software update. Normally, I would have fixed it within an hour. But this time the problem bounced between 3 departments for almost 2 days. 2 days. The same fix I used to handle quietly in 60 minutes. I watched it unfold from my desk without saying a word. Not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. Because for years I had protected the company from the consequences of its own leadership decisions. Now I was letting reality speak for itself. And reality was starting to get loud. One afternoon I walked past the conference room and heard raised voices inside. Richard and 2 department managers were arguing about missed project deadlines. Someone mentioned my name. The conversation suddenly went quiet when they noticed me standing in the hallway. That moment confirmed something important. They were beginning to realize the truth. But it was already too late to stop what was coming next. A week later, Natalie called me with news that would accelerate everything. Her company was expanding rapidly and needed a full marketing strategy overhaul. It was a contract worth far more than the small consulting agreement we had started with. "There's just one condition," she said carefully over the phone. "What is it?" I asked. "We only sign if you're running it." That sentence stayed in my mind long after the call ended, because I knew exactly what it meant. If I accepted that contract, it would be impossible to stay at Richard's company. The conflict of interest would be obvious. It would force a decision I had been slowly approaching for months. That night I walked along the Chicago River alone, thinking about the past 8 years. I remembered the excitement of my first day at the company. I remembered believing Richard was a brilliant leader. I remembered the pride I felt when our campaign succeeded. But I also remembered the nights I missed dinners with friends because a client emergency appeared at midnight. The weekends spent fixing problems that should never have existed. The meetings where my ideas were repeated by someone else and suddenly became theirs. 8 years. 8 years of building something that never truly belonged to me. As the wind moved across the water, I realized something simple but powerful. Richard thought he had power because he owned the company. But power in business doesn't come from ownership alone. It comes from trust. And trust was something clients gave to people, not logos. The next morning when I walked into the office, I felt something different. Not anger. Not fear. Clarity. I sat down at my desk and opened a document I had been quietly preparing for weeks. It was a resignation letter. I didn't send it yet. Instead, I saved it and closed the file. Because one final step still needed to happen before the story truly changed. Natalie's company wasn't the only business ready to move. 2 other clients had requested meetings during the coming week. If those conversations went the way I expected, something remarkable would happen. 3 major clients would leave Richard's agency at the same time. And when that happened, the man who once slid a 50% salary cut across the desk with a smirk would finally understand the cost of calling the wrong person replaceable. But that moment hadn't arrived yet. The real turning point, the moment that would transform quiet preparation into open revolution, was only a few days away. And when it happened, Richard Callahan's perfect office empire would begin collapsing faster than he ever imagined. The moment everything finally changed didn't happen inside a dramatic meeting room or during a shouting match. It happened quietly on a Tuesday morning when I walked into the office carrying a small folder in my hand. The building looked the same as it always had. The glass walls, the polished floors, the reception desk where I had greeted hundreds of clients over the years. But this time something felt different. Not in the building, in me. For the first time since the day I started working there, I wasn't walking in as someone who needed the job. I was walking in as someone who had already outgrown it. The previous week had moved faster than I expected. Natalie had confirmed the new contract with her company, and the numbers were bigger than anything I had handled before. At the same time, 2 other longtime clients had asked to move their marketing strategy directly under my leadership if I started my own firm. None of them asked about Richard. None of them asked whether the agency would still be involved. They simply asked whether I would be the one managing their future projects. That was the moment I understood something that Richard never did. People weren't loyal to the brand. They were loyal to the person who solved their problems. By the end of that week, I had officially registered my own consulting firm. A small office space had already been secured in a building a few blocks away. It wasn't luxurious. It wasn't flashy. But it was mine. And now the only thing left to do was close the chapter 1 had spent 8 years writing. When I walked into the office that morning, the atmosphere was already tense. 2 employees were arguing quietly near the printer about a delayed client response. Someone else was rushing down the hallway holding a stack of campaign reports that were clearly overdue. I watched the chaos with a strange, calm feeling. For years, I would have jumped in immediately, fixing every small issue before it could grow into something bigger. But that morning, I simply walked past it. When I reached my desk, I opened my email and saw 3 messages waiting from clients asking for updates on projects that technically weren't even assigned to me anymore. For a moment, I considered answering them out of habit. Then I remembered something important. Those responsibilities had been removed the day my role was reduced to administrative coordination. So I closed the email window. About 20 minutes later, my office phone rang. "Richard wants to see you," the receptionist said.
Of course he did.
I stood up, picked up the folder in my hand, and walked down the familiar hallway toward his office. The same hallway I had walked through thousands of times. But this time it felt shorter. Like the end of a long road, finally coming into view. Richard was already sitting behind his desk when I entered. His expression looked more strained than usual, though he tried to hide it behind the same confident posture he always used. "Eliza," he said, gesturing toward the chair in front of him. "Close the door."
I did.
Then I sat down calmly. He studied me for a moment before speaking again. "I just got off the phone with Natalie Carter," he said slowly.
I didn't react.
"She informed me her company will be ending their contract with our agency." Another pause. "And apparently," he continued carefully, "they plan to continue working with you." The room felt very quiet. Richard leaned forward slightly, his voice sharper now. "Would you like to explain that?"
For a moment, I simply looked at him.
Then I placed the folder on the desk and slid it toward him, the same way he had once slid that salary cut toward me. Inside the folder was a single document, my resignation letter. Richard opened it slowly. His eyes moved across the page, and I could actually see the moment the realization hit him. "You're leaving," he said. "Yes." "When?" "Today." The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. Richard leaned back in his chair, clearly trying to regain control of the conversation. "You realize," he said carefully, "that building a business isn't easy." "I know. And those clients you think are loyal? They could change their minds anytime." "That's possible." He studied my calm expression like it irritated him. "You're making a mistake," he said finally. For the first time in the conversation, I allowed myself a small smile. "Maybe." Then I stood up. Richard's voice rose slightly. "Eliza, you can't just walk away after everything this company invested in you." I paused at the door. And for the first time in 8 years, I said exactly what I had always wanted to say. "This company didn't invest in me," I said quietly. "I invested in this company." Then I opened the door and walked out. What happened over the next few weeks felt almost surreal. Natalie's company officially signed with my new firm first. Shortly after that, the financial consulting group moved their entire marketing strategy to my team. Then the real estate client followed. 3 contracts, all within the first month. For a small independent firm, it was more than enough to build a strong foundation. But the real shock came from somewhere else. More clients started calling. Not because I advertised, not because I made announcements, because word travels fast when someone who quietly held an entire system together suddenly disappears. Meanwhile, Richard's agency struggled to maintain the image of stability. New hires were brought in to replace the gap, but replacing a person is easy. Replacing 8 years of trust and relationships is not. Campaign results declined. Client complaints increased. And eventually several other companies decided to explore different marketing partnerships. I didn't celebrate any of it, not because I felt guilty, but because revenge had never really been my goal. The truth was simpler. I had just stopped carrying someone else's weight. 6 months later, I attended a business conference downtown. During one of the networking breaks, I noticed a familiar figure across the room. Richard. He looked different. Still dressed well, still confident in appearance, but the sharp certainty he once carried was softer now. For a moment our eyes met. He hesitated, then walked over. "Eliza," he said. "Richard." We stood there for a second, both remembering the same past from very different perspectives. "I hear your firm is doing well," he said finally. "It is." Another pause. Then he asked a question that surprised me. "Did you plan all of this back then?" I thought about it for a moment before answering honestly. "No," I said. "What I planned was simply to stop being invisible." Richard didn't reply. And as I walked away from that conversation, I realized something important about the entire story. The most powerful revenge isn't destroying someone who underestimated you. It's building a life so successful that their opinion no longer matters at all.